everyone. I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. Tonight, my guest is Tom Schwabel. Tom is a travel and landscape photographer whose work captures both the beauty and fragility of our planet's most remarkable places. Based in the Pacific Northwest, Tom has photographed across all seven continents with a special affinity for the high Arctic and Antarctica regions where light, atmosphere, and environment converge in extraordinary ways. Tom's imagery goes beyond aesthetics, blending fine art vision with a deep commitment to conservation. His photographs invite viewers to reflect on the importance of preserving the natural world. With a portfolio that includes collaborations with organizations like the National Parks Conservation Association, the Nature Conservancy, I think Microsoft is on that list, and
It is.
National Geographic. You can find Tom on Instagram at Tom Schwabel Photography, and you can connect with him through his website at tomschwabel.pixels.com. And there's some hyphens in there, so I'll definitely link all his contact information in the show notes below. But in tonight's presentation, Polar Expedition Photography, Penguins and Polar Bears, oh my. In this session, Tom takes us to iconic locations including Antarctica, South Georgia Island, Svalbard, and Greenland. He'll talk about the challenges of photography in these harsh environments and share practical advice for photographing everything from penguins to polar bears, icy landscapes, and some of the most isolated communities on the planet. Welcome back to the Happiness Hour, Tom.
Oh, thank you. Happy to be
Well,
here.
yes. Okay, so Tom was here back in, I meant to look, I think it was in October of 2023, so a couple of years ago already. And that was just post, well, it was a couple of years post COVID, but one of his projects was working on astrophotography. So that was a session he did. So if you're interested in that, look for session 172, and it was called Astrophotography, the Big Picture to the Distant Details. So, Tom, we were chatting right before I let people into the room, and you were kind of catching me up on your travels. So there are people that I envy their passport, and I'm pretty sure you would make that list because you've gone to some really, really interesting places. So get us started. I probably glossed over your intro just because he's been here, and but if I missed something, please take a minute and fill in the gaps for us.
Yeah, you did a great job. I'm gonna have to work hard to live up to the reputation you've now created for me. So,
Well, you're not really because your pictures will support all those words that I used tonight. So, if you guys aren't familiar with Tom's work, please take a minute and take a look. They're beautiful, and as a traveler at heart, this is welcome to Linda's Selfish Hour because Antarctica, Greenland, Svalbard, they're all on my list. So hopefully I can get there soon, one day.
yeah.
Okay. I'll let you
And
have the
just,
screen.
um, the photos that I post on my Instagram, I think we probably covered this before, usually the cell phone shots. So I
Mhm.
always encourage people, you have to actually go to the website.
Got to go to the website. That's
So,
where all the good stuff is.
yeah.
Okay. All right. It's yours.
All right. So, well, thanks for having me back here. And as you mentioned, last time I was here, I did something probably very different than what you probably expected me to do or what I normally do. It was, uh, you know, fairly technical. We're going to take it a step back today. It's not going to be so technical today. It's going to be more just exploring these places and what it's like to go there and photograph. And yeah, we'll see where we end up. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about polar expedition photography. And what exactly do I mean by that? I mean, it's what I really mean is really going to places where it's really only practical to visit them by ship, really. And not just any ship, but specifically a smaller ship where um, we can actually get on shore, um, go view the wildlife, cruise around the icebergs, all that sort of stuff, um, and really get a closer experience to the polar regions. So I guess maybe, so I guess my agenda is talk a little bit about locations, different places you can go to see different things in the polar regions. Talk about the challenges and limitations. There are a lot of challenges and limitations traveling to the polar regions. Talk a little bit about what a ship-based expedition cruise, what a typical routine is like. I've been on several, and honestly, the routine on all of them is fairly similar. And so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about gear. There's definitely a certain amount of gear preparation that you need for this, both in terms of, uh, the environments that you're going to be going into. They're cold, they're often wet. You're often in zodiacs on the water. There's all that sort of stuff. And then we'll talk about three or four, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it, different locations in the polar regions that are probably the most well-known um, and famous ones that people go to, starting with Antarctica and a little place called South Georgia, which we'll talk about, Svalbard, and then Greenland. So that's going to be our agenda. And, if there's any questions along the way, you know, uh, Linda, you'll let me know.
Okay.
Okay, so when we talk about polar expedition cruising, um, we're talking about, where are we talking about? What are we talking about going to? So there's, I think, a few locations that always come to mind. The first one is Antarctica and South Georgia Island. Oftentimes, those two are combined. Those itineraries typically leave from either Ushuaia in Argentina or the sister city in Chile that I can't remember the name of it right now. But basically, the southern tip of um, South America. And you might visit the Falkland Islands as well if you're traveling to South Georgia, and then you'll go visit the Antarctic Peninsula. And typically, you would do this in the Antarctic summer, which is going to be November through March. And really, what we're looking to see there are, of course, penguins. My favorite thing in the world is penguins. I think you'll probably notice my profile icon is even a penguin. So, um, yes, I'm obsessed with penguins. And I've seen them on several continents now. So, yeah, actually, I think I've seen penguins on four continents now, come to think of it. And then frozen landscapes. So, Antarctica is really takes ice and snow to a whole nother level. I'd been in Alaska before, and those were big glaciers on the inside passage, but they're nothing compared to what Antarctica has to offer in that department. Other wildlife, whales, definitely a lot of whales. If you're a birder, there's going to be something for you there too. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Um, and that's generally the location that I recommend would suggest people go to first if they're considering a polar expedition type cruise, is to go to Antarctica. And if they can swing the time and the budget to make that detour to South Georgia, um, totally worth it. And I think hopefully after I've shown you what's on South Georgia, you'll agree. So that's kind of in the south. Up north, we have the island archipelago of Svalbard, and that's where you go for polar bears. And that's where we want to see polar bears on their true, what I really feel like most natural environment, which is out on the ice, where they're actually hunting for seals. Um, and you obviously you'll see seals there too, and walrus, which is really just a giant seal. And that's kind of the main draw in Svalbard is going to be the polar bears. There, we'll talk more about that. But and then Greenland. So Greenland uh, is definitely a little less wildlife centric than these other places that I've mentioned. It's going to be more about the deep fjords that are there, big glaciers, giant icebergs of all shapes and sizes, and then the Arctic communities. So the Inuit and Native American communities up there, and the small isolated fishing villages and all that are really quite interesting to photograph. And probably the best time for that would be July into August. And then there's a few here that I didn't mention. Um, that would be the Russian Arctic. I did have a friend who went to the Russian Arctic a few years ago. Obviously, the political situation is such that that's not really happening anymore right now. But there's Franz Josef Land and Wrangel Island or other really good spots for polar bears. Um, and then the Northwest Passage, which would basically take you up into northern Canada. And there's a chance there, same time of year as Greenland, that you might see polar bears. You might also see things like belugas, and again, a lot more of that kind of those Arctic communities. Um, and let's see, what did I forget here? I think I got everything here. And of course, you see that South Georgia Island is that random little dot kind of in the middle of the ocean there, that the only way that you can get there is by ship. Um, so I think, as I already mentioned, these would all be on expedition style ships. And expedition style ships, you might go on a photo tour on to one of these places, um, but likely that's going to be a photo tour as part of one of the expedition style ships that's already going to these places. Um, because just logistically running kind of a private photo tour to these places, just from with the logistics involved in going to some of these places, a really small group probably isn't practical. Okay, so challenges and limitations. So we're visiting, when we go to these places, we're visiting very fragile environments. Um, just a second, change. Oops. We didn't want to do that. Um, sorry, I'm just having, okay, that's a little better. So visiting these fragile places, there's a lot of rules that we have to follow to be able to go ashore in these places and minimize our impact. And when we go to Antarctica, there is a international body that sets rules for visitation there, and there's a lot of them. probably with good reason. So the IAATO, International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, sets all the rules there. The biggest one that's, key that you want to look at when looking for an expedition cruise is keeping in mind that the IAATO only allows 100 people on shore at a time in these places. Um, and only one ship or one expedition is allowed to be in a place at a given time. So you will never go ashore somewhere and see another group. It will always be just your group on shore. Um, they have rules about minimum distance to wildlife. Typically in the Antarctic, that's 15 feet. Although in practical terms, a lot of times animals, they're not very fearful of people down there, and they will sometimes approach, and sometimes that's okay. I think that the key is that we just don't want to scare them or disturb them in any way that would change their behavior. So 15 feet is kind of the guideline. Um, leave no trace, obviously, if anybody goes camping or hiking or does things in national parks, all those principles apply. That also means that, when you go on shore in these places, um, there's not an outhouse, there's not a restroom anywhere. If you have to pack it out. So everything that you take on shore has to come off. Biosecurity is a common theme in all of the places that you'll visit in the polar regions. The idea being that we don't want to introduce uh, unwanted species or invasive things into the environment there. So, as part of the first days on, or first day or days of any Antarctic or polar cruise, there's going to be a whole biosecurity protocol and check that you're going to have to do. And that means that everything that you take ashore is going to have to be cleaned. It's going to have to be vacuumed. Um, boots, anything that touches the ground have to be sanitized. Anything like seeds or things that might stick in like the Velcro of your coat or backpack, all that stuff has to be removed. Um, and a lot of this, even going between sites, you will have to sanitize your boots and everything else, just even going between sites. So um, it's a common theme everywhere. It's, you just kind of get into the routine of it, but it's something to keep in mind. In Antarctica, drones are generally banned unless you have a special research permit, which I'm told are very hard to get. You're probably not going to be able to take a drone. So, um, and all these things that I mentioned applying to Antarctica also apply to South Georgia. South Georgia is actually controlled by the British, but the rules are generally the same. The Arctic introduces another twist, and that is polar bear safety. Um, so polar bears have an incredibly keen sense of smell, considered amongst the best of any mammals. And that means that they're able to smell prey from miles away. In practical terms, what that means is you're never going to go ashore if there's a polar bear anywhere nearby. And when you do go ashore, your guides are going to be carrying rifles and flare guns. Obviously those are a last resort, but that means that you also can't just wander off on your own and do your own thing. You have to stay in the group um, because you don't want to become dinner for a polar bear. Um, additionally, Norway has introduced some new rules in the past few years that require a minimum of 300 to 500 meters distance from polar bears. 300 meters in the winter, 500 meters in the summer. If you think of what kind of distance that is, 500 meters is, what is that? That's over a quarter mile. So from a photographic perspective, that makes things quite challenging. But there are some ways kind of around that rule that we'll talk about. And they similarly have rules of other types of wildlife, for instance, 150 meters from any walrus fallouts. Um, and these rules apply out to 12 nautical miles of Norwegian territory. So basically what this means is if you are going on a tour or a ship to go see polar bears, chances are you're going to have to go more than 12 nautical miles offshore. And that does mean when you're thinking about an itinerary and the amount of time that you're going to spend in Svalbard, if your interest is polar bears, um, trade-offs. And that is, if you travel farther offshore, you're going to be spending less time kind of exploring the wildlife and landscapes of Svalbard itself. You're going to be out in the pack ice, really just focused on polar bears. Um, and then another new twist that's developed in the past few years is avian influenza. And I believe in 2003 or 2023 or 2024, maybe it was 2024, avian influenza reached the Antarctic regions. And one place that they were particularly concerned about avian influenza was actually South George Island. And avian influenza has a very, very high mortality rate amongst, in particular, seals. I believe the mortality rate might be something like 30%. I'm not sure. I think it's a really high number. Because of that, they're now, especially when visiting places with lots of birds, like penguins, a lot of other rules that have been put into place that make photography even more of a challenge. The first one is if it looks like there's a very severe outbreak of avian influenza in any one of the landing sites, that landing site might be closed. That also means you might not allowed to bring a tripod ashore. Although in this past Antarctic summer, they did allow tripods. My understanding is that you would have just had to sanitize the feet of those tripods when getting on and off the ship. No sitting, kneeling, no putting anything on the ground because you would have to sanitize that if you put it on the ground. So um, they're still trying to understand avian influenza and its impact and what impact humans are having on the spread of it. They really want to try and make sure that humans aren't actually the ones carrying it between sites. So yeah, I was actually supposed to go back to South Georgia in 2024. And when I learned I think it was 2024, when I learned of the severity of the avian influenza outbreak that season and how many closures they had in South Georgia, I actually decided to cancel that trip that year. And we went to Sri Lanka instead of all places. So a very different place. So with all that in mind, it's still possible to get good photos. It's just, you're going to have to work a little harder. So the biggest thing about an expedition cruise is that Mother Nature controls the itinerary. And you might have a posted itinerary that says you're going to visit all these sites. And I guarantee you, every single one of these I've been on, the itinerary has changed. Sea conditions, especially because you're going ashore a lot of times in places where there's nothing but a beach. There's no dock. There may not even be much protection from the swell coming off the ocean. So, if the swell is too much, the waves are too large, the weather looks like it's going to change, the weather's already bad, that shore landing or that activity, that Zodiac cruise, whatever it is, might be canceled. And then the expedition leaders are usually pretty good about thinking about, well, what's another thing that we can do? Um, when I was in South Georgia, one of the most spectacular penguin colonies that we were supposed to visit, half the group made it ashore, and then the weather changed so quickly that the other half did not make it ashore, and they basically aborted the landing and took everybody back to the ship. So I did not even get to go ashore in that place. Um, Scouting and waiting for the perfect light, like all landscape photographers love to do, waiting for the perfect weather. In an expedition cruise, you're probably not going to have that option. You are going to have to think on the fly, um, and kind of take what you get. Typically, all the expedition cruises I've been on typically have two activities a day. On days when you're near land. Um, that might be a shore excursion, which might involve hiking, might involve hanging out on the beach, might involve just puttering around taking photos, um, naturalist walks, stuff like that. And those typically might last 3 or 4 hours. Or you might do a Zodiac cruise. That might mean that you're not going ashore because maybe there's nothing interesting on shore or no way to get ashore, or maybe you're in front of the wall of a giant glacier. So obviously you're not going ashore on top of a glacier, but you can cruise around in front of the glacier and check out all the wildlife and icebergs and whatever might be there from a Zodiac. And a lot of times, so you'll do one in the morning, you come back to the ship. They might reposition the ship during lunch. Often they reposition the ship during lunch, not always. And then you might find yourself doing something else in the afternoon, and it might also be a shore landing or it might be a Zodiac cruise. Um, so that's kind of what's scheduled. Now, the thing is, on one of these types of cruises, stuff can happen at any time. Whales can pop up. They can find a walrus hauled out on the sea ice. There can be polar bears that somebody finds. Everybody's always looking for polar bears. Um, I think when I was in Svalbard, there was a polar bear sighting at, I think it was 4 a.m. And, they wake you up for that because, polar bears, as we're going to find out, are not the easiest things to find. You can be in the middle of dinner. Oh, polar bear spotted out front off the ship. Well, I guess your dinner's getting cold now. So that means you're going to have a lot of different shooting environments to worry about. You might be photographing from the ship. You might be photographing bouncing around in a Zodiac in the middle of the ocean, or you might be on land. Um, and so those would be the days that, you're kind of near land, near landing sites. And, as is the case with Antarctica, there are days, if you're sailing from Argentina or Chile, it takes more than a day to get across the Drake Passage. It takes, I think, about a day and a half to 2 days, depending on the speed of your ship. So you're going to have some sea days. A lot of times that they'll fill that time up. You'll have workshops, photo talks, naturalist lectures, stuff like that. So that's going to be your daily routine. Um, with the key that it changes all the time. So you can have a schedule, but it's probably going to change. So how do you prepare for such a trip? Well, I think the first thing is you need to make yourself waterproof. Um, when you go ashore, most of the places you go ashore, like I said, they'll probably be rocky beaches. There won't be a dock. Um, you might have to um, you might have to travel quite a ways from the ship to get to the shore spot because of where the ship can actually anchor and where you need to get ashore. So you might be traveling through the ocean with wind and waves in an inflatable Zodiac. So first thing, waterproof boots. I use bogs. I love them. They're kind of insulated. They go almost up to knee height. You definitely want some boots that can withstand being in, at least probably 18 inches of water. Rain covers for everything. So your camera bag, definitely needs to have a rain cover. The bag I have, I think, is a Mind Shift, I think, and it comes with a separate rain cover that I can carry. But when you're in the Zodiac, you're definitely going to want, especially if it's windy or if there's swell, you're going to want to have your camera bag covered. And you may also want rain covers for your camera equipment itself because there's going to be times when you may be shooting from the Zodiac. Um, and you're in the middle of the water, so that's something to keep in mind. So gloves, definitely want some thin gloves, but they need to be ones that you can actually operate your camera with. Thick gloves obviously are going to be useless because you're just going to be taking them on and off constantly. Um, Camera bodies, I would suggest two with different focal lengths because a lot of times, you're going to be bobbing around in the Zodiac looking at, here's this amazing iceberg that I want to get this great landscape picture of. And then I notice off in the distance that there's some interesting bird flying by. And you can't be futzing around changing your lenses, bobbing around in the middle of the ocean. So two camera bodies. Because of the restrictions on avian flu, definitely a camera body with an articulated screen, I think is useful. So that way that you can, get close to the ground. I think a lot of the best shots of, penguins, for instance, you want to be at penguin level. You don't want to be at your level. You want to be at the level of the penguin. That's where the best shot is. So, being able to have a screen that you can kind of tilt, get your camera really close to the ground, and not have to actually roll around in the penguin muck um, to actually look through the viewfinder. Lenses. So this presentation, actually, in preparing this, I'd never actually studied the EXIF information for my photos to really understand like what focal lengths I was using all the time, and it was kind of really interesting to put this presentation together and with looking at all the EXIF data and realizing, well, first of all, a wide angle lens I almost never used, and I normally use wide angle lenses a lot for landscape photography. But the thing with a wide angle lens is you need to scout for a really good, strong foreground to use a wide angle lens. And um, here your foreground might be penguins, and you're not going to be able to get that close to penguins. Where they're well, they might be 18 inches from your lens, but probably not. So I think there's only two shots in this whole presentation that used a wide angle lens. And when I say that, I mean something like, less than 24 millimeters. So I use Nikon equipment, so that would be my 16 to 35. Definitely a long lens. So especially in the Arctic, I use the 200 to 500. Some days I even felt like that wasn't quite enough, but it was adequate. And you need that for whales, birds, polar bears. And I have the Nikkor 200 to 500. It is a wonderful lens for the price. It's 5.6 through the whole range, which I think was plenty fast enough. So those are some lens considerations. So your workhorse lens is probably going to be a 70 to 200 and maybe a 24 to 70. I would say are going to be your workhorses. Other things to consider, well, seasickness. So the photo there, that was us crossing the Scotia Sea, going from the Falkland Islands to South George Island. That was about a 2-day passage on a reasonably fast ship. In one day, we had 18-foot swells, which was enough to make a lot of people hang out in their cabin and not be seen for a day or two. They stopped serving soup for lunch. Go figure. You really don't know what you're going to get when you're out in these situations. I mean, the Drake Lake is famously called sometimes the Drake Shake. Um, the day before I crossed Antarctica, I met some people in Ushuaia in Argentina that had just come off the Drake Passage from a crossing, and they had 35-foot swells. Um, so I can't even imagine what 35 foot was. The worst that we had was 18. Um, but you can also have the Drake Lake, where it's basically like glass. You just don't know what you're going to get. So definitely be prepared with seasickness medication, and you've got to take it at the first sign of getting seasick. If you already get seasick, you're too late. Um, Travel insurance. So a lot of the tour companies that operate in these regions actually make it mandatory that you have travel insurance that includes emergency medical evacuation. In fact, on Greenland, there was this past year when I was up in Greenland, somebody did have to be evacuated from the ship uh, during the 2 weeks that we were there. And I can't remember exactly what they did. I think they went to the closest small village they could find, and I think the person was helicoptered to Nook, where they had more adequate medical facilities. So that is something to keep in mind. They probably will require you to have that. Um, all right. So those are just some suggestions on things to pack. I think the next is a sad story, but an important public service announcement. So do as I say, not as I do. Um, back up, back up on when you're on one of these trips. Back up every day. Um, that's what I did for most of my trips. I got lazy when I was in Greenland, and I'd never had a problem before. I'd never lost a card. And I didn't even realize I lost a card till I got home and tried to download the card, and the card was not readable. So I ended up actually figuring that card, I think, had about 5 days worth of photos on it from that trip. I ended up sending that card out for professional recovery. They actually depackaged the chip and tried to read the flash chips directly inside and try and reconstruct the data. It turns out that the flash chips themselves were electrically damaged. I don't know how. Um, so they weren't able to recover anything from this. So again, back up every day, make it part of your routine. It was part of my routine on most of my photo trips, especially these ones to the exotic places. So bring a laptop, bring a portable hard drive, bring a card reader. Make sure you have your stuff always in 2 places. On that note, let's talk about some of these places. So, South George Island, probably the most interesting place that you may not have ever heard of before. It's about 870 miles east of the Falkland Islands. It's about 100 miles long. Has a permanent population of less than 35. All the people that are here work for the British Antarctic Survey. They're basically scientists. I think the population in the winter shrinks down to less than 16. It has one of the densest concentrations of wildlife, probably in the world. I think. I kind of view it as the Galapagos of the Southern Ocean or the Antarctic region. Um, Phenomenal landscapes, um, heavily glaciated mountains, jagged bays, all kinds of interesting things. Very important for Antarctic history. It's if anybody has ever read the story of the Endurance Expedition by Ernest Shackleton and his travels to explore Antarctica, and when he got uh, stranded, um, he actually made it from Antarctica back to South Georgia, I believe, in a rowboat, and was rescued from South Georgia Island. And eventually, he was buried here, and you can visit his grave in Rittvigen. Um, Whaling relics. So this whole region was a major hub of commercial whaling and sealing, and there's a lot of kind of old, dilapidated things that can make very interesting photo subjects here. Especially, almost everybody visits Grytviken. Grytviken was a former, I think, the hub of whaling on South Georgia Island, and there's a bunch of old stuff there that's kind of rusting and decaying that's can make interesting subjects. For the bird nerds, there's a couple of species here that you won't find anywhere else on the planet. So if you need to check these off your list, there's the South Georgia pintail and the South Georgia pipit, found only in South Georgia. And so I first came to know of this place actually through, if anybody is familiar with Art Wolf's show, Travels to the Edge. I think he had an episode on this years ago. And so all the landing sites that people go to tend to be on the north side of the island. That's the more accessible side. It's the side that has the um, deeper bays and typically less ice, so it's easier to access. So I visited South Georgia. I was kind of a cool kid, I guess, ahead of most people on the wave. I think everybody now goes to Antarctica and South Georgia, but I did it, I think, 2012 before too many people had done it. And I did it on this ship here, which is the academic Sergei Vavilov. It's a former Russian research vessel based out of Kaliningrad for the USSR Academy of the Sciences. I don't believe that it's actually in use for polar expedition cruises anymore, but at the time, it came with a Russian ship crew, a captain that looked exactly like Sean Connery from Hunt for Red October, and most of them spoke not a wink of English, mostly all Russian. The ship was originally built for underwater acoustics research, which, if you think of it as just a code word for submarine hunting in the Arctic. And it was chartered by a Canadian company, so our naturalists and guides on board, an expedition leader, were mostly from Canada and some from Australia, I think. And so this was just, I thought, just a really nice shot of the ship in Jason Harbor in South Georgia, shot from a Zodiac. Um, and you can see over there, there's actually some fur seals sitting on some of these icebergs here and there. But to get to South Georgia, we have several sea days. And the nice thing about sea days is a lot of times there's often birds following you. So I feel like sea days are a great time to brush up on your birding, your bird photography. And I admit that I'm not so good at it, but like in this shot here, this one just stood out to me. I just like the contrast, kind of looking top down on the bird, so you can see the top of the bird and then the churn of the ocean below it. So kind of a more interesting kind of background. But this would be one thing that you could spend your sea days doing is just photographing all of the birds that are kind of accompanying you on this journey. This is kind of what a typical shore landing might look like. This swell actually looks a little tame. I definitely remember there being some dicier moments than this, and getting on and off the ship from the gangway could be um, equally interesting. And a lot of times, as I said before, you have to cross quite a bit of water to get to the shore because a lot of the areas that you're visiting are not well charted, or glaciers have receded to the point where the underwater charting that's been done is no longer accurate. So the ship has to anchor quite a bit of ways to not, run into any underwater moraines or other features that would be a problem. But definitely you can see everybody there, head to toe waterproof gear. I guess I forgot to mention rain or snow pants, but you'll definitely want those. And I think I also forgot to mention, come to think of it, that sometimes expedition companies will actually rent or loan you this equipment, the outerwear, if you don't have it. So that is an option. The Zodiac there also, the blue containers in the Zodiac also contains survival equipment in case the weather turns and you're stuck on shore for more than you planned to be. So they try and plan for contingencies. So your first shore landing in South Georgia is going to be a little chaotic. Um, First time I went ashore here, it was utter sensory overload in every sense of the word. Um, the sights, the sounds, and the smells as well. Um, this particular site here, Salisbury Plain, has about 50,000 nesting pairs of king penguins. And the brown guys here are the chicks. They're about 11 months old at this time. And what I love about South Georgia is I feel like it's one of the most epic and iconic places that I visited yet to get wildlife in the landscape. I feel like a lot of times you either have an epic landscape or you have a great wildlife shot, but I don't know that you get them both together. And so you'll go ashore and you'll probably be like me, and you'll probably for the first hour you'll be photographing every single penguin, making sure you documented every single one of them because you just you can't contain yourself. And then you have to start slow down and start thinking about, well, how am I actually going to get some shots that actually look like I was thinking about actually taking a good shot. Um, so we can kind of zoom in here, and this one, I mean, I really just like this tight shot here, just like the number of penguins in this frame to me was just crazy. Um, so, did this really tight just to really just focus on just the penguins and just how many there are. And, the patterns kind of, you can see the chicks kind of huddle together in the middle, and then the adults kind of huddle together in other places. And then, it's just such a chaotic scene. The parents go off to um, fish and bring the fish back for the young ones that aren't old enough to go out into the water yet, and it's just such chaos. So then, this I really loved this scene that I found, and I worked this scene for probably about half an hour while I was on shore. Just kind of hung out here. This grass here I thought was kind of a really interesting foreground, and then you have those interesting jagged mountains in the background. And the one thing about these places is the weather changes so quickly that when we came ashore, it was overcast, it was snowing, it was gray. And then the clouds just opened up like this and the sun started to come out. And, you have to take advantage of these windows when you get them. Um, and, just by hanging out here long enough, like letting the penguins kind of get comfortable, um, the little chick there in front just started to kind of wander into the frame. And, I thought that was a good place for the little chick to be. And um, yeah, again, down at kind of penguin level. So, yeah, I think that's kind of the ideal height for this. Um, Different landing site, but here again, really trying to incorporate that landscape, uh, those big, snowy, jagged mountains. Here, this nice little group of penguins was just kind of, isolated out in the open there. I thought they, made a great foreground, and then by using kind of a longer focal length, you could kind of distance compress them into the scene a little bit. Um, in retrospect, I noticed here that my shutter speed was 1/50th, which is probably a little slow. I mean, penguins, they don't move that fast, but they still move. But I was really trying to get a depth of field without focus stacking for this. And at 78 millimeters, that's kind of long to really get all this in focus. So in hindsight, I probably would have done this a little different, bumped up the ISO a bit, maybe done focus stacking, but I think it still worked out. Um, but time goes by so quickly on these shore landings. You think, oh, I have 3 or 4 hours, but before you know it, it's time to go. It just goes by so quickly. So you have to be mindful of your time and how you're spending it, and make sure that, anything that you see that's interesting, that you allocate time for it. This one here, kind of the leading line of the stream, I thought was kind of interesting here. Kind of curves into the scene there, and the penguins are just kind of, a lot of them are just hanging out in the stream for whatever reason. And of course, that kind of leads you back to the bay there in the big mountains. Um, another thing that was kind of interesting is there's a lot of molting penguins here. So penguins go through a molt once a year where they lose their feathers. And so you can see here that there's some very awkward teenage penguins like this guy right here that are half juvenile, half adult. So they're that very awkward teenage phase. And I wish I'd spent more time just photographing the awkward teenage penguins, as opposed to always trying to find the perfect penguin. Um, but live and learn, I guess. Um, Another little nice group here of king penguins, and what kind of caught my eye about this scene is, well, the fresh snow on the ground and this nice little group of penguins in the foreground, and then that hillside in the back, way in the distance, you can see all the penguins there, and the penguins go all the way up that hillside, all the way in the back. And then you have on the right there, you have this cranky fur seal guarding his little patch of grass over there on the right. So, you know, incorporating, multiple species here, and um, you can see that little bit of snow still falling. So really liked that, just kind of isolating that group in the foreground. Um, while the snow is flying, this one, I really thought this was interesting, because of the reflection. Again, this was all within an hour or two of some of those other shots that I just showed you, how quickly the weather changes. But the snow kind of blowing through the scene here, you can see a little bit of that. And the penguins, I don't know, they're just kind of wandering or huddling. I'm not really sure what they're doing here, but um, I don't know. I just thought it was interesting. And then, trying to organize the chaos. really thinking about how to organize. You've got this just chaotic bunch of things here, but how can you organize or find patterns within the chaos? And, I titled this, I think I titled this shot, "Don't You Ever Feel Like You're in the Wrong Place?" So you've got one adult here just in this sea of brown juveniles, and he kind of looks like he's looking around trying to figure out what to do here, but you know, um, definitely looking for interesting patterns. And then, bird behaviors, just watching the different bird behavior. So, here on the left, we've got a king penguin that's come back from the ocean there and is, well, for lack of a better word, barfing up dinner to one of her chicks. And then I wandered across this other penguin here that was sleeping, but when I wandered across, it just kind of struck me oddly at first. It's like kind of looks like a headless penguin. So I think penguin no headius is what I think I called that one. But just, studying the behaviors and just looking for interesting things to kind of zero in on within all the chaos. So, get the big shots, but then, get the detail shots. And that's definitely where, having two camera bodies is very helpful. So you're not wasting that precious time switching lenses. Um, and of course, there's other species on South Georgia. Elephant seal. This guy, I mean, I don't know what to say about him. He's just kind of silly looking. Looks like, I don't know, Jabba the Hutt out of Star Wars or something. They have very bad breath as a incidental side note. So probably won't want to hang around him too long. And then, of course, I mentioned some of the whaling relics. So this was at Grytviken, and this is a old whaling ship. The day we were at Grytviken, the weather was really quite gray and overcast, and I just realized that this shot wasn't going to work as a color shot. Um, and all this old rusty stuff, make it black and white, right? Then it just looks like it old stuff, right? I mean, old stuff isn't black and white. So this, I think, worked out really well because, of that overcast day. And then if you really study the image closely, it's snowing, and that snow actually almost looks like it kind of adds like a film grain quality to the image. So, but there's lots of old stuff around Grytviken, and, you can spend your entire time there just photographing all the old weird stuff. I'm only showing one here because, honestly, um, there's a lot to show here, but this was kind of one of my favorites of that. So after visiting South Georgia, next we head to Antarctica. Your typical itinerary here is going to be the South Shetland Islands. So those islands that are King George Island, Deception Island, Elephant Island. And then you're going to head down to the west side of the peninsula. So that's actually the mainland. Theme here is going to be big ice. You're going to be looking for gentoo, chinstrap, Adelie penguins, seals, so leopard seals, crab eater seals, elephant seals, skuas, petrels, different types of orcas, humpbacks, minkies. Um, and then emperor penguins in question mark, because technically I did see an emperor penguin, but you're not likely to see any. If you want to go see emperor penguins, they're mostly on the east side of the peninsula, and that is a special itinerary all into itself that requires an expedition cruise boat with a helicopter pad. So that's something that's on my list. I haven't done it yet, but it is on my list of potential future expedition cruises. One thing interesting to note is there is an airstrip in King George Island, and there are more and more companies now that are actually offering a fly to Antarctica and board the ship option so that you don't have to deal with the Drake Shake. That wasn't really an option when I did this, but that is something you can do. I feel like it's part of the experience though. But And it's not as cold here as you might think it is. Average high is really only around 34. So probably warmer than you were thinking. But when we talk about the big ice and I show you the next shot, there's going to be times when it's going to feel a heck of a lot colder than 34. Um, so big ice. So um, I just really liked this shot. It's got a giant iceberg in the foreground, and you can see a pretty healthy looking glacier and glacier ice-clad mountains kind of going up the side there, and then some fog kind of falling down from up above. And um, if I had been able to do this over again, and there'd been a boat or a Zodiac or something that I could have put in the frame for scale, I would have. But anyways, one thing to note about this is that the winds that come off these glaciers are coming from much higher up on the continent, and they're called katabatic winds. They can be incredibly cold. So, even though it might be a sunny 34-degree day on the ship, you get in front of that glacier head wall and it's going to be much, much colder. So definitely going to want your gloves and layers for that. I think this was shot from a Zodiac. I'm not 100% sure. This was definitely shot from a Zodiac. This is just in a Zodiac cruise. One of the few wide angle shots where I really was probably only about a foot from the water with the wide angle lens to really kind of get that foreground of all that just broken up ice there and the mountains kind of with a little bit of reflection in the distance. Um, and so I think Zodiac cruising, a lot of times if you can get really close to the ice, you can get some really interesting wide angle shots. That's probably your best bet for wide angle shots on these types of trips. Um, so that's the ice. Talk about penguins because I love penguins. So one challenge that I had in Antarctica is finding clean penguins. And the problem is that penguins, well, they poop a lot. In fact, I learned the other day that they poop every 8 minutes on average. And they don't really care where they do it. They usually do it in their nesting sites, which means that all the penguins coming downhill are usually dirty penguins. So they're not the photogenic penguins. The penguins traveling uphill are usually coming from the ocean. They're the clean ones. And you know how I was saying that you want to be at penguin level, and I'm trying to find penguins that are that I can kind of get at the penguin level with. And so, how do I find a clean penguin that I can get at the penguin level and get a nice backdrop? And that was definitely a challenge. Um, I'm not really sure I have any great advice, but I thought it was just something funny that you have to spend some time trying to find some clean penguins. Um, and you can kind of see why. So this was, I think, around midnight. We did a shore landing in a place called Mickelson Harbor, Trinity Island, and there's Gentoo penguin colonies here. And so we had a bit of a sunset there. Um, but the problem is it hadn't snowed that recently, so the penguin nesting sites were fairly dirty. Um, but you've got to do what you can with what you're given. So while I would have preferred this to be clean, this is the way it was. It's kind of a tricky shot in the sense that trying to get the depth of field and get close to these penguins and um, get everything sharp and the light's getting low, and the problem is your foreground's moving and you want to get stopped down for a nice depth of field. And maybe in hindsight I would have focus stacked this as well, but it worked out either way. Um, Again, trying to really incorporate the wildlife into the landscape. This was, I think, shot from a Zodiac. with a fairly big zoom so we could get that big glacier in the background there. Um, One thing always to keep in mind when photographing snow is you're typically, unless you exposure compensate, you're always going to be underexposed. So, because it's looking for that 50% gray or whatever it is. So, about 2/3 of a stop exposure compensation to kind of bring this exposure up to something more reasonable. Um, Found this little scene down next to the water. Just some penguins out sunning themselves and nice calm water, so you could get a bit of a reflection of those penguins with that nice backdrop of those giant mountains there. So this was just, I think I probably spent 20 minutes just kind of watching these guys and waiting for them to get into position and move around and, getting them all to kind of be looking, not away from you or, you know, looking at you to get them all posing together at the same time. Also on the beach, I started observing, penguins coming down to the water, and they kind of bunch themselves up at the edge of the ice, and then they think about going in, but then they don't go in, and they think about going in, and then they don't go in, and finally one jumps in, and they all follow immediately. And that they're worried because there could be a seal in the water, and so they don't want to be the first one to jump in, but they eventually they need to go in the water at some point, um, so I spent quite a bit of time just kind of standing here right at the water's edge, waiting for these guys to jump in, and I think I nearly flooded my boots doing this, standing in the water. Um, and again, they weren't the cleanest penguins because they just come from the nesting site, but I thought it was kind of fun to have one in midair like that. Different species here. This is a chinstrap penguin. They almost look like they have little army hats, which I feel kind of describes their personality as well. They're kind of mean penguins in my opinion, but was able to find this guy on the beach here and get a nice chunk of ice on the beach kind of in the background just to make it look a little bit more interesting. There weren't as many of these around, and it was tricky to find places um, where there was kind of a more grand backdrop of them. So I just kind of had to focus on what was on the beach here. Again, kind of watching the bird behavior. This is an Adelie penguin, and caught this one ruffling his feathers here, which I thought was kind of an interesting little pose. Um, these ones were definitely much more friendly and curious, and they kind of approach you and check you out. Um, and then you could I really liked this shot a lot. It was kind of like, I feel like the three amigos here just kind of wandering off into the sunset. So, trying to find little groupings of birds like this. And yeah, this had a really nice, I liked the clean minimalist background of this as well. Um, this one was a tricky one. I can't honestly give you any advice on this one except just shoot. Penguins, a lot of times when they're in the water, they'll porpoise. I think they can actually swim a little faster if they do this, kind of like dolphins. Um, you just have to be in an area where there's a lot of penguins, and you kind of have to get lucky at some point because you don't really know where they're going to pop up. So you have to be fast on the trigger and lucky. And this is what I was able to get. There were some other folks with some even fancier gear that got some really amazing shots of this, but just a lot of patience and luck. But trying to get a porpoising penguin, I think, is definitely a goal. So those were some of the penguins and wildlife. The ice in Antarctica. So one thing that kind of frustrated me during my time there is that we had a lot of bluebird days. And when I think of Antarctica, I think of moody, overcast, clouds hanging down over the mountains kind of things. And we had all these kind of bluebird summer sunny days. And it's like, well, what do you do with that? And so finding this iceberg here, well, I decided, well, I don't know, maybe stick a sun star at the top, stop down, make it almost like it's kind of like an iceberg beacon or something. So, this was shot at f/20 to get that sun star from a zodiac. And as you can see here, this was also shot at wide angle. So this is, again, one of those times um, shooting the ice where we were able to get close enough in a zodiac to something interesting to where the wide angle kind of works. Um, that same zodiac cruise, this one, there's I think a lot going on in this shot that I thought was interesting. That there's a leopard seal on this piece of sea ice here. You can kind of see under the water how much that sea ice extends. And then as another zodiac that I included in the frame here. So you really get an idea of what photographing from a zodiac would look like. And the zodiac in this case just makes a really great photographic subject because the company I went with provided all that waterproof outerwear and it all happened to be red. And what better color can you have to go with the blue than red? Um, so, that kind of gives you an idea of, what photographing from a zodiac might look like in and amongst the icebergs. So here we have a zodiac just serendipitously in between these two giant pieces of ice. I thought it was just a really cool shot. Only thing here is you can't get too close to these really tall icebergs because sometimes they can roll and you don't want to be next to them when they roll. Um, Sunsets in Antarctica, when you're that far south or north, they last a really long time because the sun doesn't go below the horizon very much. So we got to work this scene and kind of watch it change for probably about 40 minutes, this lenticular cloud. And it never really got dark. So you have, between about 11 o'clock at night and 3 a.m. in the morning, you can have some really good light. And maybe you'll be lucky enough to be on a shore excursion for some of that, like we were in Trinity Island. More whaling history. This is on Deception Island, an interesting kind of volcanic island where sometimes the beach gets really steamy because it is volcanic and the sand is still warm from the volcanic activity underneath. So now let's talk a little bit quickly about Svalbard. So 78 degrees north, population of only about 3,000 people. Makes it the world's northernmost settlement. This time of year, when you visit for polar bears, it's 24-hour daylight. Sun does not go down. There's about 250 resident polar bears in the area. 3,000 kind of in the larger Barents Sea area that I believe is shared with Franz Josef Land. And this is where you go if you want the really iconic polar bear on ice shot. You can go to Churchill in Manitoba and you can see polar bears there up close, but you're not going to get to see them on ice like you will here. And this was the ship that I was on in Svalbard. This was a Lindblad ship. So National Geographic Expeditions Lindblad. It's kind of the landscapes of Svalbard. Not a lot of glaciers here, not super heavily glaciated in a lot of the places we visited, kind of more of these hills like this. This I thought caught my eye because there seemed like there were so many stripes throughout the scene. There were stripes on the mountains that almost looked like there was stripes in the clouds, and then you could get some of those reflections in the water. It's what it's like to be out on the ice north of Svalbard. This, I believe, is about 80 degrees north. Um, on the lookout for polar bears. And this is more the light that I was really hoping to get in Antarctica, kind of that moody light. There's kind of a distant shower over there. You're really hoping that maybe a sunbeam breaks through here and lights up an iceberg. But this is kind of more of what I think of and would hope to and look for up there. So on looking for polar bears, especially after going to Antarctica, need to manage expectations a little bit. So this is what those glossy brochures are going to tell you that you're going to see. It's going to be a typical polar bear sighting. Um, this is often what most polar bear sightings are like. So that's through a spotting scope. And that polar bear, I'm guessing, was probably maybe up to a mile away. So that's not to say that all polar bear sightings are like this. Obviously, I have a picture here that shows that they're not all like that, but most of them are going to be like this. We saw 11 bears in our 7 days in Svalbard. Only one of them was close. And part of the problem is, well, there's not many of them, but they're also hard to find. So this is the play the find the wildlife game. So there was a polar bear swimming in amongst all this ice that somebody spotted from the bridge of our ship. This polar bear was not on the ice. It was swimming at the time it was discovered. And it became very curious of us and actually decided to approach. And this was before those new rules that went into effect in 2024 or 2025. So it could approach. Um, you can still get this close, but of course, as I mentioned earlier, you'd have to be outside that 12-mile limit. This is kind of more just showing you the vastness of the ice, the landscape in the background, and of course, I mean, the polar bear still looks tiny in this vast landscape. This is getting a little closer with that bear. That bear got very curious about us. It eventually decided it was so curious it was going to climb up onto this big blue iceberg and check us out. And that's when we were able to get some nice shots of this bear. And you can see here, all of these were at 500 millimeters. Again, that exposure compensation up about 2/3 of a stop because there's a lot of white in this scene. And this wasn't really cropped that much. This is pretty much pretty close to the full frame. Some different poses. She kind of stood up for us here. So another little fun pose. So yeah, that was our one good polar bear sighting on that trip. Also saw some walrus. Again, about 500 millimeters, not really cropped in this case. Kind of composed this with kind of this kind of diagonal zigzag line through there, which I thought was kind of interesting. Put these guys down in the corner here. Didn't see a lot of walrus. They're kind of a hard thing to come by. So that's why I said, managing expectations. You have to work much harder for your wildlife in Svalbard. Birds, that's the one thing that there are places. There's plenty of birds. These are some bird cliffs up on the north side of the island. This again shot 500 millimeters. These are guillemots. They're nesting on these tiny little ledges here. They're actually laying eggs there. And you could do some really this was next to those cliffs. I took this with, this actually is even still pretty zoomed in, 200 millimeters, but just all the birds in the air next to these cliffs. I felt like it was kind of like an apocalyptic scene here with all these birds in the air. And then some flowers at 78 degrees north, just really close to the ground to get this purple saxifrage. There was no way you could get all this in focus unless you wanted to focus stack. So I was okay with just having the saxifrage there, and then the rest of it just kind of blurs out. So that was Svalbard. Then on to Greenland. So the eastern part is very sparsely populated, um, improving accessibility. They just opened a big airport in Nuuk. There's actually flights from the US to Greenland now, so you might find it easier to go to Greenland. Really looking here for deep fjords, sculptural icebergs, and cultural. So Inuit, Norse ruins dating to 1000 AD, and wild and remote, colorful communities. Some wildlife here, um, not much. Again, everywhere that you go here, I think I mentioned before, you'll have to have an armed guide. You're in polar bear country, except when you're in those villages. You leave the villages, you are in polar bear country. So these are some of those icebergs. I didn't quite get the spotlight that I was looking for, but there was just enough light filtering through to light these two up enough to kind of make for a really kind of moody scene here. As I mentioned before, the Holy Grail would be finding a distant iceberg with a perfect light beam on it. I didn't find any of those, but I found a lot of really interesting ice. And this was shot from land. And the ice comes in some really crazy forms. This was an ice arch that we encountered in a fjord. And we found many ice arches. I decided to pick this one for the slideshow because I liked the fog that kind of isolated it a little bit from the background. And supposedly these things don't really last that long, a few days before they collapse at most. There is a photo tour that you can do out of eastern Greenland that goes on a little sailboat that focuses specifically on icebergs. I've really been interested to try it. And you're actually allowed to fly drones in this area too. So that is something that I may think about for the future. But, along with the grand, interesting shapes, we can focus in on the details of the icebergs. I'm really starting to love abstract things in the past year or two. And so this was just a real close-up of an iceberg, just interesting shapes and kind of color variations. And this was in a fjord on our last day up there. Be surprised to find flowers in Greenland, but they were there. And I found them on this particular shore outing in Disco Bay. I did not have a tripod with me. I really wish I did because the depth of field of this really, really lended itself to focus stacking. I can see I was at ISO 800 f16 here and only 1/80th. And, with a 45 megapixel camera, that's kind of pushing it, especially with a lens that isn't stabilized. But anyways, be it as it may, I thought this was kind of fun with the kind of the little creek, or I don't know what that is there, with the algae kind of leading you out to the iceberg. This was, I guess I lied. I guess I did have one shot where, there was a distant iceberg that was kind of just being spotlighted. This was in the ice fjord that likely originated the Titanic iceberg in Disco Bay. It's the one that generates most of the icebergs on East Greenland. But I used a telephoto lens here to really get to that gleaming iceberg just kind of out there in the distance. Talking about that Greenlandic culture, the last few slides here are just really showing you some of the Greenlandic culture, kind of more the human aspects of Greenland. This is a Greenlandic dog. It's species only to Greenland. It's actually illegal to import non-Greenlandic dogs into the area to keep the species pure. They use them as sled dogs, and this puppy here I found along the side of the road and was really curious to meet me. And there happened to be some sleds kind of in the background that you can kind of see blurred out of focus in the background. So I thought this was kind of a neat shot to have the sled dog puppy and then the sleds kind of in the background there. Um, Boats, everything in Greenland is a fishing village. And so really looking at boats, I loved the simplicity of this shot. I love that the fog kind of washed out the horizon a little bit. There's kind of an iceberg sticking out of the fog a little bit here. This is something I discovered last week as I was kind of going through the photos. But yeah, really when you're in Greenland, just capturing boats and things on the water is definitely essential. And here's another boat like that. This one, I liked the layering of the fog and then the iceberg. And finally, the colorful houses that you hear about in Greenland. So originally, the colors were supposed to mean different things. Like red was supposed to be a church or a school, and blue was supposed to be a fish factory. Now people just paint them whatever they want. But I found this vantage point up on a hill. I mean, these are like the $1 million view houses here with what's in their backyard, the fjord and the icebergs back there. So just really cool to just get a lot of the really iconic things of Greenland all in one shot. The icebergs, the fjord, the colorful houses on the hills all in one shot. Again, similar, but the fog was clearing from this mountain here. You know, the weather changes so quickly that this is a completely different shot 5 minutes later once that fog was gone. And finally, scale. So this was shot, 400 millimeters from the ship. But this giant cliff face with a little bit of sun illuminating it, and then that little road of colorful houses on the kind of the cliff's edge there, and then this giant iceberg just kind of floating by. I just thought was just so iconically Greenland, and the iceberg really and the houses really giving scale to the whole scene. And so that's kind of a summary of the different places and just some of the shots that I've seen from there. And that's kind of all the shots that I've got to share. And I apologize because I realized the first slides I went a little long, but hopefully people found it interesting. So
That's okay that you gave us, let me get you to take your screen down. You gave us a very comprehensive look into the things that we consider if we were going to take one of these trips. So, and I think there's one or two people in this room that have these places on our wish list. So, this is a great resource. So, thank you for doing that. Personally, I was hoping that you would get to more photos because I could have looked at 2 hours of photos of just penguins personally, but
well, that was the thing that I was struggling with. And I realized, since I never put this presentation together before, is I really wanted it to be informative as opposed to just here's a bunch of pretty pictures.
yeah,
And I see what you're saying. And I could have put a lot more pictures in, but I was really trying to, give you a perspective of what it might be like for you to go there and take these
yeah.
shots.
Oh no, I think it's going to be useful. I think Ben Cowan is taking good notes in here. So he's one of my buddies and pals that does a lot of
Yes.
traveling. All right, let me go ahead and say, Tom, thank you for coming and sharing all this stuff. This was a lot of, like I said earlier, this is going to be more of a resource for somebody that's considering taking one of these trips. Um, and you covered it very thoroughly. So, okay, I don't usually plug other people or that kind of stuff, but was there a tour group that you use that you'd recommend? Specifically because you're a photographer. So was there a photography workshop tour that you'd recommend?
So originally, the first time I went to Antarctica, I went with a guy by the name of David Schultz, who was at the time I met him on Flickr. He was a well-regarded uh, photographer of Antarctica. He'd been there several times. Unfortunately, he has passed.
Okay.
Um, most of these companies typically have staff photographers on board that
Hmm.
kind of lead photo workshops and things like that. Like if you go with Lindblad,
Yep.
chances are they're going to have a National Geographic photographer on board that's going to give photography talks. I
Hmm.
mean, you can find dedicated
Yeah.
photo workshop cruises, but they're not that common. More likely, you're going to be mixed in with, that 100 people is going to include other groups.
Okay. All right. That's fair.
So I can't really recommend one over the other. I mean, I've tried, a few. I mean, Lindblad was fine. The other companies I've used, one of them doesn't exist anymore, so I can't really say much about that. But
Okay.
um, yeah.
That's fair. All right. With that, let me close out this session. So next week, Amy Jasic will be here to share her presentation, The Imperfection Zone. Y'all have a good night, and we'll see you next week.